Okay, hi everyone. Hopefully everything is working correctly and you can hear me. Today we are discussing uh, René Descartes' Discourse on Method. And as we discussed last time in class, we are using Descartes, thinking about Descartes as the quote-unquote father of modern philosophy. Descartes, in Discourse on Method and in his follow-up to that, Meditations on First Philosophy, is trying to restart the project of Western philosophy, trying to create a new kind of philosophy. So let's jump into the text. We're going to discuss Descartes first, and then if we have time, we'll get to Immanuel Kant's essay, An Idea for a Universal History from a Cosmopolitan Perspective, and we'll discuss the ways that Kant is developing Descartes' thought. I think Descartes combined with Kant gives us a pretty complete picture of what you might call the project of modernity. And hopefully we'll see how that's the case. So Discourse on Method, and we are using the translation by Donald A. Kress. So the full title of this text, Discourse on Method for Conducting One's Reason Well and for Seeking Truth in the Sciences. I just want to make a few comments. I'm going to try to not comment on every little thing in the first 20 pages or so, but I do want to make a comment on this title. There are certain assumptions that are being made by this title and sort of ideas that are being forged already in the title. So to begin with, right, we have this thought that the correct conducting of one's reason, right, to conduct one's reason. So what is the method that we're going to learn about here that Descartes is outlining? It is a method for using reason. How should we use our reason? Reason is, of course, the thing which philosophy has always said separates us from the animals, makes us unique. And Descartes is asking, what is the proper use of that reason? And what I want to point out is this conception of reason already assumed in the title of the essay, that reason is a tool. Right? Reason is something that we need to learn how to use the way you learn how to use a hammer, the way you learn how to use a 3D printer, whatever piece of technology you're thinking about, right? Reason is a kind of technology almost, right? It's a tool that can be used well or poorly. And, you know, we will see over the course of the semester other ways to think about reason. So I think right now we should just flag that and ask, is reason a tool? Is our thinking a tool? Is the ability to think a tool in some way? So we'll leave that as a question for now. Now, the second thing I want to point out in this is, who is Descartes advising, or for whom is this method going to be valuable? Right? For the individual and for seeking truth in the sciences. Right? So this method that Descartes is laying out is a method for correctly using reason and for seeking truth in the sciences. So the method that an individual should use in order to properly conduct or use their reason is the same method that should be used in the sciences to find truth. So how an individual should reason, how a scientist should reason, and the implication being that individuals should be reasoning as scientists, right? The same method that we use to seek truth in the sciences should be used by individuals in their everyday life, right? So the thought that we should all conduct ourselves as scientists in some sense. And this is a very modern idea. We're looking for things in Descartes that sort of signal the advent of the modern world, this conception of each individual as being able to, and even for it to be desirable for every individual to think as a scientist, is one of those moments. And the sort of call to think as a scientist, this need for this method, for this discourse on method that Descartes is answering here, is certainly caught up in many of those major forces that I mentioned last class, right? And which he discusses in this text. The science of Aristotle, the science of Ptolemy, has been overturned by Galileo and Copernicus. The assumptions of Catholicism have been challenged by the Reformation and Martin Luther. And with the age of exploration and scientific revolution, we are seeing diversity of peoples, diversity of cultures, new technologies, new ways of knowing, and all of this requires or solicits a new way of navigating the world, thinking about the world, judging the things of our world. And this is what Descartes is trying to provide. The primary topic, however, and there's more of this than maybe seems like there should be in a philosophy text, is the sciences and his scientific discoveries. Descartes was a scientist and thought of himself as a scientist. And this discourse on method accompanied several essays that he wrote in the sciences, particularly in optics, in meteorology, and in geometry. This text, Discourse on Method, accompanied Descartes' essay describing analytic geometry. Descartes is one of two people to claim to be the inventors of analytic geometry. So this Discourse on Method was published alongside these scientific treatises that were meant to sort of prove the effectiveness of his method. And in the discourse itself, we get a lot of discussion of very scientific questions. Right? There's in part 5 a long discussion of blood flow, of how the heart works, which is not particularly pertinent to our interests or our discussion here, but there are some important moments in part 5 in particular that I want to hit on, so we read the whole thing. And so in his introduction, on page 1 of our text, he says that this method is about the sciences, but it's also about morality, right? That he believes using the same method, we can make good judgments about truth in the sciences, what is true empirically, and good judgments about ethics and morality, right? What we ought to do. It's sort of one method to rule them all. So morality is, in Descartes' worldview, subject to the same sort of scientific scrutiny as the natural world. Right? We should approach questions of morality, questions of ethics and politics, questions of custom, with the same sort of scientific attitude that we would approach questions about nature or physics. Right? Now, he begins with what is also, I think, a distinctively modern idea. He begins by saying, everyone has common sense, right? Everyone has reason. And this means, for Descartes, that everyone has the same capacity to judge the true and the false. All people have the same share of reason. Now, this is a kind of humanist view of humanity, right? The idea that there's inherent worth in all people, but also that all people, regardless of their birth, right, whether they're born into the aristocracy or born to the peasantry, whether or not they're born in China or in France, where Descartes is from, whether they're born male or female, right? They all have the same fundamental rational capacity. What accounts for the differences between people is their upbringing. So he says on page 1 that we have such different view of truth and falsity, or good and evil. I'm sorry. He says on page 2, on page 1, it is not enough to have a good mind. The main thing is to apply it well, right? So what accounts for the difference between people is how that innate, meaning inborn reason, is used, how it's applied. And so we have that a kind of, what we might think of as sort of Protestant ethic here, right? Which is, you can do anything you want. You can do anything you set your mind to, as long as you apply yourself to it. That is a Cartesian thought, in this sense that our rationality is innate. All we have to do is use it appropriately, and any one of us can achieve anything. So this reason is in all people because it is what makes us what we are. Right? Descartes is going to pick up that Aristotelian idea that human being is the rational animal, right? The zoon, logon, echon, the animal with logos, the animal that is able to speak the truth. On page 2, he writes, mind alone makes us men and distinguishes us from the beasts. I prefer to believe that it exists whole and entire in each of us, and in this to follow the opinion commonly held by the philosophers. So, mind makes us human, and what is this mind? What is reason, as it's so far been laid out? The ability to judge the true and the false. Right? Now, so Descartes begins from this very egalitarian place. We all have the same capacity. What separates us is how we apply that faculty of reason. He says, using the method that I'm going to lay out here, everyone will have the tools they need or the knowledge they need to use their reason correctly. And what do we get when we use reason correctly? What is the benefit of using reason correctly? It is contentment, right? Happiness of a certain kind. It is the contentment that comes from exercising your faculties to the greatest extent possible, from realizing your potential to the greatest extent possible. Descartes believes that with this method, we can be, to put it sort of sillily, be all that we can be, right? To use military rhetoric. It says, with this method, on page 2, with this method, I have the means to increase my knowledge by degrees and to raise it little by little to the highest point which the mediocrity of my mind and the short duration of my life will be able to allow it to attain. Right? We as human beings are inherently limited, right, by the mediocrity of our minds. We only have so much mental capacity, and the duration of our lives. Right? We can only live and think and experience for so long. So we are inherently limited, and this will become an important point. But using this method, we can achieve the most that we can hope to achieve within our limitations. Right? So this method will teach us to find the truth, and in finding the truth, we will achieve our sort of purpose as being humans, as being animals that have minds. So there's some sense that this method also brings about a kind of liberation, right? With this method, all people can learn to teach themselves. Descartes is giving people the tools to improve themselves and the world, right? Descartes is giving the tools to everyone, not just to improve themselves, but to help make progress in the sciences, to become scientists, to participate in this new modern world. Now, maybe this is a good moment to mention that Descartes is constantly worried about how his writing is going to be received. He is conscious of the fact that what he is saying might be regarded by many as dangerous. And this project of providing people with the tools to think for themselves, the tools to become scientists of a sort, and to evaluate truth and falsity using nothing but their own innate reason, is one of the things that Descartes thinks might be considered dangerous in his books, in his philosophy. It has always been considered controversial among the powerful, among the rulers, among the elite. It's been considered dangerous to educate the people, educate the masses. So this whole framework that seems perhaps to us obvious, run-of-the-mill, for Descartes is quite edgy and even dangerous, right? To assume that all people are inherently equal, have the same innate rational capacity, and if they just apply their rationality correctly, can achieve anything, right? To say a commoner, a peasant can achieve the same things as a prince if only they apply their reason well, is politically dangerous, right? Descartes knows it. So I think there's this, it's something that almost every reader of Descartes remarks on, this sort of feeling of hesitation. Descartes remarks on it himself, right? That he's constantly sort of anxious about whether or not he should say X, Y, or Z. He wants to hold himself back. He's constantly seeming like he's withholding something from us, which gives the whole text a kind of strange air, a strange tension. So I think we should take Descartes at his word, but maybe not take everything he says completely at face value, meaning that I think what he says is true, but there's a lot that is left unsaid, and what is unsaid might be important. And in many ways, sort of in the same way that there's so much left unsaid by Plato, that the rest of philosophy after Plato has been sort of attempting to fill in everything that Plato didn't say. I think we could say the same thing about Descartes, that modern philosophy, the next 200 years after Descartes, is largely trying to fill in the holes left in Descartes' philosophy, right? To say what Descartes left unsaid. So absolutely, there's a lot that is withheld by Descartes from us here in this text, and he's doing that because he's worried about political repercussions. And I think this is something that we're going to think a lot about this semester, and it is a sort of fundamental question of modernity: is what is the political valence of science? What are the political implications, the political consequences of the natural sciences? In what ways are the sciences themselves political? Are they political at all? Are they completely removed from politics? What is the relationship between the natural sciences and politics? And we have, in this very early example of modern philosophy in dealing with this question, this really interesting moment of tension, right, where Descartes is clearly aware of the fact that his interest in science and his philosophy has political ramifications and political implications, and will be viewed by those with power as politically dangerous. And he tells us that his scientific method has nothing to do with politics. So, on the one hand, Descartes is acknowledging through this sort of subtle tension, at times explicit tension, that there is political import to the sciences. And then on the other hand, he is telling us that there is no political meaning. There is no political import to his scientific method, to his method of thinking. So there's confusion on this point here. And I think Descartes, if he isn't dissembling, if he isn't evading this topic, is, protests too much, as they say, about the neutrality, the apolitical nature of the sciences. Right from the beginning, for example, he tells us that this method, this thought experiment that he's embarking on, is not for all people. While everyone has the innate capacity to reason, not everyone should feel that they have to follow Descartes where he's going in this text. This is about his own way of thinking, his own intellectual journey, and he's not telling anyone else that they need to follow him where he's going. He says over and over again, other people don't need to do this. No one should imitate me. As we are reevaluating our way of thinking, what we don't need to do is reevaluate our political forms, our politics. He is always warning us against following his lead. And yet, he's also saying, this is a way for you as an individual to think for yourself, to become liberated from all these illusions that and falsehoods that our society is riddled with. So he says that he says this again on page 2, he's putting forward this essay merely as a story, or if you prefer, as a fable, in which, among some examples, one can imitate. One will perhaps also find many others which one will have reason not to follow. And I hope it will be useful to some without being harmful to anyone. So he presents this discourse as a story, a fable, something that no one should take too seriously. Right? Just a little story about how I used science to prove my own existence, to prove the existence of God. Right? Nothing to take too seriously. So this also is sort of ironic and full of tension because, of course, this is taken extremely seriously. And in writing this, Descartes caught the attention of many powerful people who he probably would have preferred to remain anonymous to, and was eventually forced into self-exile, had to leave France and moved to Holland, where he continued writing. So people did take this seriously, even though he did everything he could to prevent them from taken too seriously or thinking there's any danger in any of the ideas that he's espousing. So let's get into what this project is a little bit. He sets the stage for us with a little bit of autobiography, telling a story of what led him to what is called the project of radical doubt, to reinvent the wheel, to recreate Western philosophy. He says, he begins with his college days, and he says that, right? In my college days, just as you might hear today. He says, in my college days, I was extremely eager to learn everything that the scholars could teach me. And he tells us a little bit about everything he learned, and how in college he discovered what he really learned was that none of his professors, none of his teachers could tell him anything with absolute certainty. Right? That everything ended up being, as he saw it, baseless. And so everything your teachers tell you is not true. Don't listen to your teachers. This is Descartes' message. Don't listen to what your teachers tell you, because it's all just passed down knowledge. Right? Your teachers tell you what their teachers told them, and they tell them what their teachers told them, and so on to infinity. Right? So that education becomes indoctrination. You learn what people say the truth is, but you don't learn what is actually true. No one can give you a solid argument for what is true. Everything ends up being baseless. So he says, morality is absolutely foundationless. None of our moral ideas have any certainty to them. Right? The writings, he says, of the ancient pagans that deal with morals are built on nothing but sand and mud. So the first thing Descartes does is juxtapose these kinds of knowledge, moral knowledge, with mathematical knowledge. He says, what interested me more was mathematics. Right? On page 4, he writes, I delighted most of all in mathematics because of the certainty and the evidence of its reasoning. But I did not yet notice its true use, and thinking that it was of service merely to the mechanical arts, I was astonished by the fact that no one had built anything more noble upon its foundations. So Descartes says, what I learned in college is that there is no certain knowledge about morality. No one can give an argument about what is good that has certainty or any solid evidence to it. It's just passed down knowledge. But he also learns that mathematics does have this kind of certainty. So this juxtaposition between ethics and mathematics is to show that there is no certainty in ethics and to point out what true certainty looks like. Real knowledge is mathematical knowledge. And he remarks, or he says, it's strange, he's astonished that no one had built anything more noble upon the foundations of mathematics. The implication already is that all knowledge, perhaps even knowledge about morality and ethics, should be based in mathematics. Why? Because mathematics is the only thing we know with certainty. The only kind of knowledge that's really valuable is certain knowledge. And we have to seek that kind of certain knowledge in ethics, in morality, if they're going to be worth anything. And the best way to go about looking for that kind of certain knowledge is to build off of the certain knowledge we have in mathematics. So already Descartes is sort of trying to bring in questions of morality and ethics to the realm of science and mathematics. Right? We need to have a scientific approach to morality. And again, as I said last class, one of the motivations for this is the recognition that morals, ethics, politics, customs, culture changes from one people to another, from one historical period to another. So if one people believe one thing is right, and other people believe another thing is right, and neither of them has any solid evidence for why their belief is better than the other belief, then right, we can't trust either belief. All that knowledge cancels itself out. Right? This is what Descartes says about philosophy in general also. Right? It's impossible to trust any philosopher or any philosophy, because for any philosopher that says X, there's another philosopher that says Y, that says that X is false. And because each philosopher gives their own evidence, their own reasoning, and both kinds of reasoning are, appear to be valid, that we have to say that neither one of those, that none of those forms of philosophy is really true or really counts as knowledge. All philosophy cancels itself out because we don't have that kind of firm foundation that we have in mathematics. So we have to doubt all philosophy. We should doubt all of the sciences because we're learning that our old scientific ideas are false or being overturned. And we have to doubt everything they teach us in college because it's just received wisdom. He says, after a long time of studying the world, of learning from other people, and of conducting natural science, conducting scientific experiments on nature, right, that he needs to search for the kind of certain truth he's looking for elsewhere. It says on page 6, but after I'd spent some years thus studying in the book of the world and then trying to gain some experience, I resolved one day to study within myself too, and to spend all the powers of my mind in choosing the paths that I should follow. In this I had much more success, it seems to me, than had I never left either my country or my books. So, having studied the world, he decides he has to study within himself also, and that in studying himself, he has more success in looking for something certain than he had when he was looking in the world. The world teaches him only how little he can learn, how little is known with certainty. But reflecting on himself, right, thinking about himself, he learns a whole different form of certainty. A kind of certainty about metaphysical things, about ethical and moral things, as the kind of certainty that you can have in the sciences, he believes. So this is really where the fable begins, where the kind of myth that Descartes is spinning begins. He says, this is on page 7, he tells of how on the way back from the coronation of the emperor, That would have been the Holy Roman Emperor in Germany. He is heading back to rejoin the French army to fight in the 30 Years' War. Right? And it's probably worth noting, this is a war that was largely framed by religious differences. It's a war between the Protestants in Germany, Protestants of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Catholics in France and Spain and elsewhere. It's not wholly a religious war, but that's one of the main motivations, one of the main causes. So this is the backdrop, right? An incredibly destructive war being fought over religious differences, different religious ideas. And here Descartes is saying all these different ideas about what's good, about what's true in morals, in ethics. None of them is certain. So already, and by mentioning the war, his readers won't be able to help but understand this context, right? Descartes is sort of implying, he's asking, why are we fighting this war? What is the point of this? Right? Neither side has indubitable evidence. What is a better way of thinking? What is a better way of applying our reason to avoid this kind of war? So he's been to the coronation of the emperor, he's heading back to the army, and he finds himself in a cabin in the middle of winter by himself, a stove-heated cabin. And finding himself alone, in solitude, he begins this experiment, essentially, kind of scientific experiment on himself, a kind of internal observation or reflection. It's a very interesting idea, application of kind of scientific method to your own inner life. Solitary environment, solitary setting. Modern world begins in solitude, with one person looking within and looking for certain truth within, kind of certain truth that will be not just particular to that individual, but universal for all people. And he gives some justification for this idea by saying that he thinks the products of one mind are more beautiful, more complete than the products of many minds. That one author can do a better job producing something than many authors. But his justification is not as important as his method, right? So we know that this method is about correctly using reason. And how does one correctly use reason when reason is applied to your inner life? This is where he begins, again, what is called the project of radical doubt. He's going to uproot everything he believes, to attempt to rid himself of all of his opinions. Right? Again, he says, don't try this at home. Right? This is dangerous. To attempt to erase all of your beliefs. So he writes on page 8, as regards all the opinions to which I had until now given credence, I could not do better than to try to get rid of them once and for all, in order to replace them later on, either with other ones that are better, or even with the same ones, once I had reconciled them to the norms of reason. Right? So even if I happen to believe certain things that are true, if I don't know why they are true, it's better that I dismiss them as false and then reinstall them once I understand why they're true. And so to get rid of everything he believes. In the second sort of attempt, second pass at this story, in the Meditations on First Philosophy, he calls this the general demolition of my opinions, right? To rid himself of all that garbage he learned in college, everything he'd been taught by his parents, his friends, so forth. And now he says, he lays out a couple rules for himself. And he says, I very much want to tell you about these rules that I've laid out for myself. Obviously, he doesn't want us to think that he's taking this experiment too far. So he says the rules that he's laid out are 4. First, never to accept anything as true that I did not plainly know to be such, carefully to avoid hasty judgment and prejudice. Oh, I'm sorry. Forgive me. The rules he lays out are 4. And these are rules that are going to prevent him from deviating from social norms too much. This is an assurance that he isn't doubting anything that it would be either treasonous to doubt, for example, the divine right of the king to rule, or sacrilegious to doubt, for example, the existence of God. So he says, as I begin this project of radical doubt, I am going to lay down some cautionary rules. Number 1, I won't break the law or doubt religion, and I will keep the customs that are normal in our society, customs of moderation above all. And so I'm going to doubt everything, but don't worry. In doubting everything, I'm not going to act on this doubt. I won't break the law or any social norms. And, he says, I won't apply this doubt to religion. His reasoning here is interesting. Whether or not you buy it or not is up to you. But he says essentially, right, it is not the place of a mediocre mind, again, like my own, to doubt religious ideas. Right? I don't have sufficient use of reason. My power of reason isn't strong enough to even doubt religious ideas. Religious ideas are beyond the scope of reason, and therefore I shouldn't expect to apply reason to religious ideas. Whether or not Descartes actually believes this, or if this is a way of protecting himself, is anyone's guess. By all accounts, Descartes was a sincere believer. So what he is going to end up with is an idea of God. I think it's certainly conceivable that he believes he is not breaking, any sort of rules of piety in his philosophy. But definitely, this is something that he would have been worried about other people believing about him. So the first rule is don't do anything that's going to get me in trouble with my community. The second rule is a little more interesting, I think. This is essentially that if his thinking leads him someplace strange, he will trust reason, trust his thinking over the impulse to deny his thinking because it strikes him as strange. And this is a good rule of thumb. It isn't part of the method explicitly, but it is a good sort of meta rule, a rule about how to use the rules, right? Which is that if your conclusions, if your reasonings lead you to a conclusion that seems to you must be false, trust your reasoning more than your intuition that your conclusion is false. Why? Right? Because that intuition that your conclusion is false is a product of your upbringing, product of your circumstances, of your culture, of the customs and norms of your society. If reasoning leads you someplace, you must trust reason, no matter how strange the place is that you end up. This is good scientific advice, right? If you discover something that seems impossible, it's only because no one has ever thought of it before. So, third, my maxim was always to try to conquer myself rather than fortune, to change my desires rather than the order of the world. Now, this also is good advice. This is kind of the whole philosophy of Stoicism, right? This idea that I need to know what I'm able to change and what I'm not able to change, to give me the strength to change what I can, and the grace to accept what I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference. So what Descartes is saying here is, I must conquer myself rather than fortune. If I arrive at a conclusion that is not strange, but which I dislike, I also have to accept the conclusion, right? My method reveals the world as it is, not as I would like it to be. And if I don't like the world as it is, I can't go back and try to reason differently to get a different conclusion. I have to accept the world as it is and then change what I expect from the world, change what I might like or dislike about the world, change the way I am with regard to the world rather than try and change what the world is. Here comes the ice cream truck. So these are the kind of guidelines that Descartes gives himself for thinking about or for applying these rules of method. All right, so let's now go over the method itself, right? The method for the correct use of reason. And these are 4 rules. This is on page 11. The first rule says, the first was never to accept anything as true that I did not plainly know to be such, carefully to avoid hasty judgment and prejudice, include nothing more in my judgments than what presented itself to my mind so clearly and so distinctly that I had no occasion to call it in doubt. Okay, so there's a bunch going on in this dense section here. Okay? To never accept anything as true that I did not plainly know to be such. Now, what this means is to essentially never make an assumption, right? To never assume that anything is true. Don't assume that what your mother told you is true. Don't assume that what your teacher told you is true. Don't assume that what your priest or doctor or guru tells you is true. Assume nothing. we'll see in just a minute how difficult this actually is, to assume nothing. Next clause, carefully to avoid hasty judgment and prejudice. Now, Descartes is constantly warning about this, not to make hasty judgments, to not rush to judgment. The method he's describing is a slow one. What we need to do requires patience, requires careful observation, and methodical investigation. So anything hasty is going to go against the rules of the correct use of reason. Be patient. And avoid prejudice. Now, prejudice is slightly different than an assumption, but it's very similar, right? Prejudice is different from assumption in that it may not be laid out clearly the way that an assumption is. Prejudice is something that colors a different judgment. It is something that affects your reasoning. Right? It isn't something that you begin with as a kind of ground to start reasoning, but it is something that changes the way that you will reason, the kinds of logical moves that you're willing to make, that you are most likely to make. So not only to avoid hasty judgments and assumptions, but to avoid those sort of personal desires or cultural expectations that might influence your reasoning. Maybe we all know what prejudice is, right? But Descartes here is clearly laying out prejudice has no place in science, in correct reasoning. We have to, as much as possible, get rid of it. And this in itself is kind of an enormously important thought, right? Because to think without prejudice means to think completely objectively. It means to think completely universally and neutrally. Perhaps Descartes has already made an assumption that this kind of thinking is possible. His response to that would be, I think, we see an example of this, of reasoning that is done without prejudice, without assumption, and that avoids hasty judgment. That is mathematics, again. Mathematics proceeds without prejudice. We need to always attempt to be as unprejudiced, as balanced, I suppose, as mathematics. And finally, to include nothing more in my judgments than what presented itself to my mind so clearly and distinctly that I had no occasion to call it in doubt. What is it that marks a truth that is without prejudice or assumption, a truth that has been arrived at through the correct method, carefully? It is that an idea presents itself clearly and distinctly. Now, what precisely Descartes means by this is unclear. But I think we can all think of moments in our own thinking, in our own lives, when we have really learned something or realized something. And in that moment of learning or realizing, there is something that in your mind clicks. And there is this kind of epiphany, right? Where it's clear as day. Suddenly everything makes sense. And from then on, you have that idea clearly and distinctly in your mind. And when you're working out a math problem, when you're working out something, learning a language or working on something mechanical, and if you're looking for a kind of solution, any kind of solution, there's a moment where you realize it. And I think that moment of realization is what Descartes has in mind when he's thinking with these terms, clear and distinct. And that moment of realization, I think Descartes is right. That pure moment of realization, a pure moment of learning something, is without prejudice, without assumption, is pure in some way, objective. And it's that moment of realizing that is going to really be the foundation of all of Descartes' philosophy. And the second thing, second rule, second maxim for this method is to divide each of the difficulties I would examine into as many parts as possible and as was required in order better to resolve them. Break the problem down into its constituent parts. Very, what seems to us like obvious stuff, but only because, right, we have been teaching this Cartesian method for a very long time. But breaking things down to their constituent parts is philosophically interesting for the following reason, which is that Descartes is telling us that in all our judging and all of our reasoning, what we need to first identify is what is basic in existence. What exists as a unit, a one. We need to find out the elementary particles of existence. What is it that is the foundation of being? This is what will be required of Descartes using this method when he begins asking about himself, about morality, ethics, metaphysics. The third rule of method, to conduct my thoughts in an orderly fashion by commencing with those objects that are simplest and easiest to know in order to ascend little by little, as by degrees to the knowledge of the most composite things, and by supposing an order even among those things that do not naturally precede one another. Okay, so to proceed from the simplest to the most complex. Once I've broken this down, whatever my question or problem is, once I've broken it down into its composite parts, to then build up to the most complex. All right. And then finally, the fourth rule of his method, everywhere to make enumerations so complete and reviews so general that I was assured of having omitted nothing. The last thing that Descartes is worried about here is omitting something, right? That I would fail to take into account something important. And the way to avoid this, he thinks, is to make enumerations so complete and reviews so general that nothing can be omitted. And so to think about the problem in its entire context, to break it down to its smallest parts, and then think about everything that would affect each of those parts, to build it up into its most complex whole, and then think about everything that would affect the whole. Now, this is not the scientific method as it is practiced today, and there's a lot of philosophical discussion about what the scientific method really is, if there is in fact such a thing as the scientific method. But if there is such a thing as the scientific method, or a singular scientific method, this is certainly not it. These are more like rules for thinking, rules for informal logic or critical thinking. But that's good enough for Descartes' project here. So let's get into this project then. Right? There he is in his cabin in winter, and he is thinking about himself. He writes on page 18, "For a long time I had noticed that in matters of morality, one must sometimes follow opinions that one knows to be quite uncertain, just as if they were indubitable, as has been said above. But because I then desired to devote myself exclusively to the search for the truth, I thought it necessary that I do exactly the opposite, that I reject as absolutely false everything in which I could imagine the least doubt, in order to see whether, after this process, something in my beliefs remained that was entirely indubitable." Okay, so here I am alone in my cabin. What I want to do is apply this method that I've been using to think about the sciences, and which I've made several scientific discoveries, to what we now call the human sciences. I want to apply this scientific method to morality, to metaphysics. What that means to begin with, right, to follow his first rule, is to demolish all of his assumptions. Because everything he had been taught about morality was, as he says, uncertain, and because he should not allow anything, he should not assume anything that is at all uncertain, he has to get rid of everything he's been told about morality. But he doesn't just stop there, at erasing all of his uncertain assumptions about morality. Because he wants to apply this method to now not just the physical natural world, but to the entirety of being, and to his inner life, to all of his thoughts and all of his opinions. He has to extend this demolition of opinions and assumptions even further. So he says, this has to be extended not just to what I've been taught about morality, but to everything I believe about the external world. Thus, because our senses sometimes deceive us, I wanted to suppose that nothing was exactly as they led us to imagine. And because there are men who make mistakes in reasoning, even in the simplest matters in geometry, and who commit paralogisms, judging that I was just as prone to error as any other, I rejected as false all the reasonings that I had previously taken for demonstrations. So, not just everything he's been taught, he's also going to doubt everything he's learned from his senses. He's going to doubt everything his senses tell him. Let's start with that. He's going to doubt sensory knowledge. What that means is he's going to doubt, for example, that he sees what he believes he sees in front of him. He's going to doubt what he feels. He's going to doubt that he in fact feels a chair under him or feels the ground under his feet. He's going to doubt what he hears. all of his five senses. What is included in this is his own body. Right? He's going to doubt the existence of his own body. How do I know I have a body? I know it by feeling it, because I sense things. But if I doubt the veracity of what I sense, if I doubt that I'm in fact seeing what I'm really seeing, then I should also doubt that this thing which sees actually exists. Now, why? Why would you doubt that what you're seeing is actually there, or actually what you're seeing? Why would you doubt the knowledge of your senses? Well, remember, Descartes says we have to doubt anything which we are capable of doubting, anything that can be doubted. And he says our senses often mislead us. They often give us reason to doubt. Think about when you put an oar into water. Right? This is a classic philosophical example. When you put anything into water, you put a pen into a glass of water. The pen suddenly appears to be bent, right, where it enters the water. If you take it out again, it goes back to being straight. So, when it's out of the water, your senses report that the pen is straight. When it's in the water, your senses report that the pen is bent. Well, which of those is actually true? Is the pen in itself really straight or bent? Your senses report each fact with equal veracity, meaning each one appears to be equally true. The only way you would differentiate between those two sense experiences, the straight and the bent pen, is through reasoning. So your senses mislead you, and anything that misleads you once might mislead you all the time. You can't trust your senses then. And this is an argument that he develops more in the Meditations also, right? If my senses mislead me once or ever, I shouldn't trust them. In the same way that someone testifying in court has their credibility hurt if they have a history of lying, right? You're less credible if you're capable of lying or if you have a habit of lying. Well, our senses, Descartes thinks, have this habit of lying, and therefore need to be doubted. Let's just think about where this leaves us for a minute. We doubt our senses. We doubt the existence of the entire world, the entire external world. The only way we have knowledge of the external world is through our senses, by hearing other people speak to us, by seeing other people, by seeing the trees outside, by hearing the cars go by feeling the table, by feeling the ground beneath my feet, by tasting my food, etc. Right? I have no way of having any knowledge of anything external to myself except through my senses. So without sensory knowledge, if it's really true that our senses can't be trusted, then the entire external world needs to be doubted. I need to doubt even that there is an external world. In the Meditations, Descartes goes through this in more detail and gives more arguments for this. It's possible, he thinks, that the entire external world is like a dream, and that my senses deceive me in waking life in the same way that my senses deceive me in a dream. In a dream, I see things, I taste things, I hear things, I feel things, I smell things. My senses report things to me in dreams that are in fact not real at all. So how do I know that my senses, when I'm awake, aren't reporting things that are as illusory, as fantastical and invented. How do I know that I'm not dreaming right now? The waking world is also a dream. How can I know? Descartes' point for now is not through my senses. If I rely only on my senses, I can never know if I'm dreaming or awake. So, better to ignore every piece of knowledge I've gotten through my senses. Now, this is everything. Anything that's outside of myself, I have to treat as though it doesn't exist, as though it's not real. Assume that it's false. Assume that there's no such thing as a tree, or ground, or an earth, or a table. But he goes further than this even. And he says, because there are men who make mistakes when reasoning, even in the simplest matters of geometry, and judging that I was just as prone to err as any other, I reject as false all the reasonings that I had previously taken for demonstrations. I should also doubt that any reasoning I do, I might be wrong about. That that my reason might be fundamentally flawed. That every deduction or induction or any kind of logical move I make is right, like using a broken machine. I'm trying to think of a great example, analogy I don't have on the top of my head, right? But if you put something into a program and the program doesn't run the way it's supposed to run, but has a virus or a bug or something, what you will get as a product won't be what you intend to get, won't be what the program is meant to produce. So we believe that our senses represent the external world to us as it really is. We believe that our reasoning makes logical moves in the way that kind of objective logic would go, but we have no way of knowing for sure if our reason and our logic are actually making if our logic is objective with respect to the external world, right? If our logical moves represent the external world in the same way that our visual representations of the external world might be false also. So he's left with nothing, not knowledge about nothing at all. Sorry, my downstairs neighbor's child is crying. Now, in the meditations, we get a little bit more about where this leaves Descartes. He spends a paragraph discussing what is essentially an experience of nihilism that comes out of this, right? Which is the belief that nothing is true. If all the knowledge I have from my senses and from reasoning, if even my belief in the existence of my own body is doubtable, then what can I possibly have? Right? Descartes is looking for that which is indubitable, which cannot be doubted, whose certainty is absolute and undeniable. Stop for a second and think if you can find something in yourself, right? It's Descartes warns us against doing this. I give you permission, right? To reflect and think if there's anything, any piece of knowledge you have that you don't arrive at either through the senses, something you've experienced in the world, or through reasoning about something you've experienced in the world. what Descartes is looking for is innate knowledge, is a kind of knowledge that we have by virtue of being the beings that we are. An inborn knowledge, knowledge that we're born with. Something that doesn't come from our experience of the world, and that therefore isn't a product of reasoning about the world, but a piece of knowledge that we have before we experience the world, before we reason about the world or judge the world. Now, is there any kind of knowledge that is like this? He says, immediately upon realizing that he knew nothing, that there was nothing he could be certain about. This is interesting, right? Immediately after I noticed that, he says, on page 19. I'm sorry, page 18. Immediately after I noticed that, while I wanted thus to think that everything was false, right? As he's having the thought, everything is false, but immediately after I noticed, but immediately afterward, I noticed that while I wanted thus to think that everything was false, it necessarily had to be the case that I, who was thinking this, was something. Right. So, I have to doubt every piece of knowledge, and just as I'm realizing nothing is true, everything is false, in that moment, when the world completely drains away, Descartes hits upon something else, something that is prior to and outside of the world, prior to and outside of even his own body, which is, it necessarily had to be that I, who was thinking this, was something. And noticing this truth, and noticing that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so firm and so assured that all the most extravagant suppositions of the skeptics were incapable of shaking it, I judged that I could accept it without scruple as the first principle of the philosophy I was seeking. So, at that moment of what we could call nihilism, when there is no world, there is no body, Descartes encounters this indubitable, certain fact, which is the fact of himself thinking, right? Of thinking itself, in fact. What is there that is outside the world? There is thinking. What can't I doubt the existence of? I can't doubt the existence of thinking. I can't doubt that I am thinking. Now, this is, there's a lot to be said about this, right? This is the most important of Descartes' ideas, the most famous, right? The I think, therefore I am. And often this idea is misunderstood or misinterpreted, right? A common misinterpretation would be, if you're not having philosophical ideas, then your existence doesn't really count. You aren't living life to the fullest, right? If you're not doing deep thinking, you aren't really a person, right? Bill Nye, the science guy, had a famous moment of misunderstanding this idea, which is sort of ironic, being a science guy. But that's not it at all, right? It is, for Descartes, an epistemological discovery. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, and right, what counts as knowledge. This is the only thing that we can be absolutely certain of in the world. All knowledge is based on this fact that I think, that there is thinking. It is proof of existence, proof that something exists. That's the meaning of I think, therefore I am. Proof, moreover, more importantly, that what I am is a thinking thing, that my essence, that which is indubitable about me, is my thought, my not quite reasoning yet, right? Because it's not per se reasoning in the sense of judging. It's more that moment again of realization, right? Descartes hits upon something. He sees proof of existence in thinking. Thinking proves existence. Now, this fact is indubitable. I cannot doubt that I'm thinking, because in the act of doubting, I am once again thinking. To question whether or not I'm questioning is to affirm my existence, right? I can't truly question my existence. I can't truly doubt my existence. It's a kind of judo move, right? You use the strength of your opponent against you, no matter how intensely I doubt my own existence. That intensity just gets turned right back around on that doubt to more fully and intensely prove that I exist. Now, this in turn, this I think, therefore I am, and I should note, because I'll refer to it again, is most commonly referred to in philosophy as the cogito. I think, therefore I am. The Latin translation is cogito ergo sum, which literally means I think, cogito ergo, therefore I am sum, but it's referred to just by the first word, the cogito. Right? So if I refer to the cogito, I'm referring to this, this saying, I think, therefore I am. The cogito provides the foundation for Descartes to find other truths. Right? Remember his method. Start with that which is most certain, that which is simplest, and then make things more complicated. So the first question then is, all right, I've proved that I exist as a thinking thing, but I still can't prove that the external world exists. And how am I going to do that? How am I going to do that with just this one fact that I know I exist? I can't even prove that my body exists. Right? And this is the origin of the mind-body problem in philosophy. That Descartes is able to prove that he exists as a thinking thing, as a mind, long before he's able to prove that he exists as a corporeal thing, as a body. So there is, for Descartes, a fundamental disconnect between our minds and our bodies. And this is going to be what he attempts to solve now. But he begins by asking in general, can I prove the existence of anything external to myself, external to my mind, anything physical? So he says, from the cogito, from I think, therefore I am, he says, from this I knew that I was a substance, the whole essence or nature of which is simply to think, and which, in order to exist, has no need of any place, nor depends on any material thing. Right? Thus, this I, he goes on page 19, that is to say, the soul through which I am what I am is entirely distinct from the body and is even easier to know than the body. The soul is easier to know than the body. This is true. I mean, to the extent that, right, or at least the body is fairly difficult to know. You're much more intimately familiar with your desires, your guilt, your loves, your fears, etc., than you are with what's happening in your pancreas right now. So he says, after this, I considered in general what is needed for a proposition to be true and certain. For since I had just found one of them that I knew to be such, I thought I ought also to know in what this certitude consists. So, how am I going to get myself out of this this void where I am the only thing that exists and I only exist as a mind? I need to know how to make a proposition. For example, a proposition like the table exists. What will an absolutely indisputable, indubitable proposition look like? Right? He says, I've just found one. I think, therefore I am. What is it about this proposition that makes me know it's true? Having noticed that there is nothing at all in this, I think, therefore I am, that assures me that I am speaking the truth, except that I see very clearly that, in order to think, it is necessary to exist, I judge that I could take as a general rule that the things we conceive very clearly and very distinctly are all true. Okay, so we return again to this idea of clarity and distinctness. Right? But what is this experience of clarity and distinctness? I ask again. Right? What does it mean to realize something, to learn something? It says, I decided to search for the source from which I had learned to think of something more perfect than I was. And I plainly knew that this had to be from some nature that was in fact more perfect. All right, I got a little ahead of myself there, but this moment of realization is a moment of witnessing something clear and distinct, of witnessing something true and recognizing it as true. That, Descartes thinks, is a moment of experiencing the perfect. Insofar as, for example, I think, therefore I am, like 2 + 2 = 4, is perfect. It is indubitable. I think, therefore I am, to a greater extent than 2 + 2 = 4. And that perfection is also experienced in the moment of realization. What Descartes is recognizing here is that in that moment of realization, in that recognition of a clear and distinct truth, he witnessed something perfect, and that this perfection could not have come from him. Why? Because he is imperfect. Something perfect can't come from something imperfect. For the same reason that something small can't produce something big, right? You can't give birth to a baby that is larger than your body. What is perfect has to be produced by something perfect. Only the perfect can produce the perfect. Descartes says this is for the same reason that it's impossible something should come from nothing. Something can't come from nothing. Nothing can't produce something. It would have to have something in it in order to produce something. Nothing has nothing in it, so it can't produce something. By the same token, something imperfect can't produce something that is more than it. That is like producing something from nothing. Now, this realization of truth, this realization of perfection, then, points to the necessary existence of a perfect being. And this perfect being, Descartes says, on page 19, it thus remained that this idea had been placed in me by a nature truly more perfect than I was, and that it even had within itself all of the perfections of which I could have any idea. That is to say, to explain myself in a single word, that it was God. Right? So this realization of perfection is also inherently a realization of God. God here is understood only as a perfect being. That's what God is for Descartes. So let's go through that one more time. I doubt everything. I hit upon something that can't be doubted, which is that I am thinking. I think, therefore I am. In realizing that truth, I encounter something perfect, in that truth is perfect. Recognizing that perfection, I then realize that I cannot have been the cause of that perfect thing because I am imperfect. Something imperfect can't produce something perfect. Therefore, there must be a perfect being which has produced this idea of perfection, this truth within me. And that perfect being can only be God. Now, there's a lot more metaphysics in here that we can discuss more in our live meeting. But this is the, I think, crucial Cartesian idea, right? And what's really essential here is a kind of order of operations. I begin with doubt, assuming nothing, and then I discover myself. And thinking, the human subject, human mind, is the foundation for all further knowledge. But what the human mind is capable of knowing, of receiving, is given by God, and God is truth. the priority of the human, right? That the human is even prior to God in Descartes' reasoning here, right? We are more certain, or first certain of ourselves. And though that certainty is given to us by God, it is knowledge of God, but knowledge of ourselves that is the foundation of everything we can know. Now, as we'll see, well, let me say a little bit more. We've got to wrap up in the next 10 minutes, but what does it mean that God is truth? That what Descartes is calling here is this perfect being, and that perfection is viewed as a kind of certainty that is equivalent to mathematics. It means that God, you might say, is reduced to a kind of mathematical, scientific concept. God becomes certainty. God becomes objective truth. And similarly, the soul, right? When Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, what is it that I am? He says, I'm a substance. He says, I'm a soul. But that substance and that soul is mind, is a thinking thing. My soul is my mind. And my soul, God, you might say, through this moment of realizing the truth, through scientific discovery, through realization and learning. Right? The soul is that which has the capacity to know God. And what that is equivalent to, for Descartes, is the mind is that which has the capacity to know the truth. And he's going to push this a little further. Right? God, as the truth, is identical, or essentially identical, to nature. Right? Because what kind of truth do we discover? What kind of truth can we find through this method? What kind of truth is Descartes interested in? What does Descartes think perfection is? Thereby think God is? He thinks all these are found in these mathematical, scientific kinds of certainty. Where are those found? In the laws of nature. So he says on 25, it is certain, and this is an opinion commonly accepted among theologians, that the action by which God preserves the world is precisely the same as that by which he created it. So that even if in the beginning he had never given it any other form at all but that of a chaos, provided he established the laws of nature and bestowed his concurrence in order for nature to function just as it does ordinarily, one can believe, without doing injustice to the miracle of creation, that by this means alone, all the things that are purely material could over time have been rendered such as we see them now. In other words, God set up the system of nature, system of natural laws, and set it going, set it in motion, so that God now is the same as the functioning of nature. Now, there are places in Descartes where he makes some distinction between God and nature. And as I said, great deal of philosophy after Descartes is dedicated to trying to fill in the gaps, right? Make up for what Descartes didn't say. I think this is one of the very important things that Descartes is a little bit ambiguous about. Right? Is God identical to nature, or are they just very similar? But in any case, nature is like God, if not God himself. And so, right, natural philosophy, natural science becomes very much like theology. I can't have any true knowledge about morality, have true knowledge, certainty about the natural world, and therefore it is with science that we come to have knowledge of God. Now, let's just take a minute here. We've got to stop in a second, but think about as a kind of whole and say that what we have here are this groundwork for modern worldview, right? Which is to think of the individual as, first of all, to begin with the idea that all people have an equal share of reason, and that if we only apply our reason correctly, anyone is capable of anything. Kind of egalitarian, universalist, humanist view. But then we add in this sort of imperative to scientific doubt. Right? We have an obligation to not make any assumptions, to not take anything as true that we don't know clearly and distinctly. Right? That the appropriate way to be a person, to use your reason, is to follow this method, right? To be skeptical, to doubt almost everything, and to only say that which you know to be true with certainty. Proceeding from the skepticism, we also have a kind of solipsism, or this idea that I will be better served by reflecting on myself and looking within. I will find more knowledge by looking within than from talking to other people. So a kind of self-oriented idea about the pursuit of knowledge. And then, finally, that what knowledge is, the only thing that really counts as knowledge is that which is as certain as mathematical truths. And then to say, God is nature, right? Now, to say that God is nature is not to say that God is an animal. There are always two different concepts of nature at work within modern philosophy. There is the concept of kind of brute nature, the nature of the animals the nature that works by instinct, that is without reason, right? That is entirely irrational. Descartes has a long section about this, about how animals don't have reason, don't have language, that they are entirely irrational. So one kind of nature that is without reason, and then another kind of reason, which is a system of nature, natural law, and natural laws. That is the ultimate rational structure, the system of nature. And so for Descartes, the human being is between these two kinds of nature. We have the nature of animals, and we are like animals when we use our reason incorrectly, when we squander our capacity for reason. When we correctly use our reason, right, we come into harmony with the system of nature. We can work within that system. We can understand it. We can, to a greater degree and a higher level, be one with that nature, the system of nature. And it's in this sense that Descartes thinks through the use of the correct use of reason, we can become, as he says, the masters and possessors of nature. So this is what he sees as the purpose of this method of his. And what he sees as the purpose ultimately of rationality and of being human, of our relation to ourselves, to the world, and to God. And I think it's fair to say this is a direction that modernity and history since Descartes has taken. So he writes on page 35, "For these notions made me see that it is possible to arrive at knowledge that would be very useful in life, and that in place of that speculative philosophy taught in the schools, it is possible to find a practical philosophy, by means of which, knowing the force and the actions of fire, water, air, the stars, the heavens, and all the other bodies that surround us, just as distinctly as we various skills of craftsmen, we might be able, in the same way, to use them for all the purposes for which they are appropriate, and thus render ourselves, as it were, masters and possessors of nature." And so, if it is possible to find a practical philosophy by means of which we know the force and the actions of fire, water, air, and the stars, the heavens, right? If we were to know the system of nature works, then we could put all of the bodies of nature, all the things of nature. And if we know the laws that govern nature, we can put the natural things that are governed by those laws, the animals, the plants, etc., to work for us. Nature can become our tool. Right? We can use nature for our purposes. Right? We can render ourselves masters and possessors of nature. We can become like gods. We can become like God, in that God is, among other things, an understanding of nature. Right? We cannot be the cause of nature. We cannot affect nature or take responsibility for it, but we can come to understand nature, and in that understanding, be godlike in our relation to nature. And as such, we can make nature subordinate to our desires, right? Remember what Descartes says. I have to learn not to change what is, but to change myself to fit what is. So once I know what nature is, then I know how I can use nature to my purposes, what nature can do for me. And so this is, right, very much the project of modern industrialization, technology, and to a great extent, the project of modern science, right, to understand nature in order to subordinate nature to our purposes. Now, as I said, there's a lot more metaphysics that we go through there, but we have to stop. We didn't get to the Kant essay at all. Just as well, we can go over it in the discussion. I recommend reading it on your own. It is, I think, connected to Descartes most obviously because it is the political articulation of this project. How can we reach a global politics that is going to be based in this kind of method? Kant is, in very interesting ways, using what I think is a distinctly Cartesian method to arrive at a cosmopolitan politics, a global society and a global political order that would be based in these objective and absolutely certain terms and ideas that Descartes is talking about here. All right, so that will do it for today. And the next video will be jumping ahead nearly 400 years to think about existentialism and the sort of Cartesian hangover we get in 20th century existentialism. All right. Thank you and good night.